Dogworks Radio is sponsored by Alaska Dogworks. Check out their website at alaskadogworks.com. You can support this podcast on patreon.com/Tiamaneke.
This episode of the podcast is brought to you by First Paw Coffee Company, specializing in private label premium blend coffee. If you're serious about coffee, you should check it out. First Paw Coffee's passion is high-quality, small-batch roasted coffee. They take the extra time to taste and get everything perfect before they release new blends. They aim to bring you a cup of happiness each time you pour yourself some coffee. Find out more at ak.dog/free and enter for a chance to win some First Paw Coffee prizes, a book from our collection, and tote bag. One winner will be selected at random each month. That's ak.dog/free.
Radio Free Palmer 89.5 KVRF presents Mushing Radio, hosted by Robert Forto. Mushing Radio is about dog-powered sports, living in the Great White North, and mushing. Visit our website at mushingradio.com. Here is your host, Robert Forto.
Hello and welcome, everybody. This is Robert Forto, and you're listening to our daily coverage of the 2020 Iditarod here on Mushing Radio on KVRF 89.7 in the Mat-Su Valley. RadioFreePalmer.org is our live streaming site, and you can hear all of our episodes over on dogworksradio.com. Please do us a favor and hit that subscribe button wherever you're listening, and you will get all of our podcasts as soon as they drop. And I am joined today by our co-host of our Iditarod coverage, Alex Stein. Alex, how's it going today?
It's going great, Robert. I'm down here in California where it has been raining for most of the past 2 days, which seems very odd since I've spent a lot of time looking at videos of Alaska where there is just a ton of snow on the ground. There
is a ton of snow, but just about everything else is closed up. It's interesting that, as we spoke about it yesterday, the Iditarod is just sort of beating their own drum and just kind of making their way down the trail, and they have the most extreme form of social distancing of just about anywhere in the country, don't they?
They really do. And, I said on Twitter last night or a while ago that mushers basically invented the idea of social distancing. And if you talk to a lot of mushers, they say that, they don't like being around really crowded places. And then they'll name some place that has a population of like 1,000 or 2,000 people. So, there are a lot of mushers, even some of the mushers who live in and around Anchorage, who really just love being out in the middle of nowhere.
They do. And speaking of where we're at in our standings, we just talked about it right before airtime that Jessie Royer is leading the race. She is in Galena or just about to Galena on the Yukon River right now. And it's interesting, last night she was the first to the Yukon there in Ruby and got the big 5-course dinner and the cash and all that. But she said that she couldn't eat all that food and had to share it with some folks there, and she shared it with her competitors.
Yeah, and it's interesting because some of her competitors who got in a little bit after she did, like Aaron Burmeister and Thomas Werner, took their 8-hour mandatory Yukon River rest at Ruby. Jessie was there for about 5 hours and then chose to leave and continue up the trail. And so she now will have to stay at one of these Yukon River checkpoints for a full 8 hours. And I think that is something that, if the race is really close, maybe, something that people will look back on and question, because if she had spent another 3 hours there, she would have completed all of her mandatory rests up until White Mountain, where everyone has to stop. So that potentially could be something that could turn around and bite her.
And there's only 2 more checkpoints, I believe, on the Yukon River. That is Galena and Nulato. I don't believe that they consider Caltag a Yukon checkpoint, do they?
I'm not positive. I was going to actually ask you about that, but so it's either 2 or 3.
Yeah, so it'll be interesting how that strategy plays out, and we'll definitely keep our eyes open for sure. Right after we got off the air yesterday, we had a scratch with an interesting twist. What was that?
Yeah, so Jeremy Keller scratched last night, and he did a Facebook Live explaining it, and then there was a post by his wife, also on Facebook, talking about it, and he basically said that with everything going on in the world today, and with things being shut down and people dying, that he felt that it was best for him to go home and be with his family during these stressful times. And then he announced that he was going to be actually mushing his dogs back from, I believe, Nikolai to Willa, which is a couple hundred miles, 200 or 300 miles. And he lives in Knik now, and he's going to be going back rather than, just taking a plane back and having his dogs brought back later. His wife posted on Facebook that he was going to be going back and would be documenting his journeys for people. And she said that now that he's no longer in the race, he can feel free to broadcast this information. And when people are in the race, there is a limit to, they can't broadcast directly, and they can't broadcast to unapproved media outlets, so that they can have the official media outlets cover the race more, and the Iditarod Insider cover the race more. And so that's the basic situation.
It is. And for folks that may remember, several years ago, he was on one of those Alaska reality TV shows. I believe it was one about the small town of McCarthy, and he lived there, and he talked about living off the grid with his dogs, and a real colorful character, wasn't he?
Yeah, he really was. And, I don't want to be disrespectful, and but some people who are more cynical would say that maybe this is a way of getting more attention to himself. It does strike me as odd that if he is so concerned about being with his family, that he didn't just fly home and be with his family.
Yeah, really interesting. We had two other scratches in the last 24 hours, Alan Eichens and Niels Hahn. Niels, he has been out of the race for several years, and he decided to come back and run it this year. What do you know about these two guys and their scratch over the last 24 hours?
Yeah, we haven't gotten a lot of information about it. It was just the standard that they had scratched for the good of their dog team. So I imagine we'll be getting more information about that. Those just happened a few hours ago. So they were both taking their 24s in McGrath, and both of them decided that it just wasn't working, and they weren't going to continue on the race.
So let's circle back to our front runner now, Jessie Royer. She posted a video, actually the news station, Channel 2 here in Alaska, posted a video, and Didi Genro is the special correspondent for that station, and she was talking to Jessie about a mishap on the trail. What was that?
Right. So apparently, and this is an example in my mind of just how tough most Iditarod mushers were, because when Jessie was describing it, it was very, matter of fact. And she said, "Oh, and my sled caught fire," and Didi then was trying to get her to, elaborate on that a little bit, because sleds don't normally catch fire, and that's an unusual thing. And she said that there was some heat that she had, some of the fire starter that she had, and she didn't realize that it was actually burning. And she had put it in her sled next to a bag of trash and a bag where she had booties, and she didn't realize that it was actually burning. And then it burned some of the booties and some of her trash and some of the rope and the lines on the side of her sled. But it strikes me as both wonderful and slightly absurd that someone could be nonchalant about a sled literally catching on fire.
And that she was just saying, oh, well, I had this bag of trash. It sort of caught on fire, but I kind of dealt with it and kept going down the trail. Again, that's definitely something that a musher would think about for sure. And it's a very cool story for sure. What else do you have for us today in terms of news?
So, we talked a little bit yesterday about the city of Nome canceling public events and closing a lot of these public spaces that were open for tourists and for other people to go to. And there was considerable complaints among fans and other people and some relatives of mushers about that this wasn't really a great thing and it wasn't all that fair. And there was a very cool post from Margaret Maxner, who I believe is Kelly Maxner's wife, on Facebook today. And I'm just going to read this. It's relatively short. She said, I understand the frustrations that we as family members, fans, and spectators are having with the restrictions in Nome this year. However, please consider the following. An outbreak of COVID-19 in the rural Alaskan villages could be devastating. Nome is a central hub of rural Alaska, and an outbreak there would spread very rapidly. Many of these villages have little or no medical support. Historically, native populations have been particularly susceptible to introduced illnesses. Elders in these villages who are at the highest risks for complications or death would need to be transported by air ambulance to hospitals for treatment. If the humanity of the situation doesn't concern you, then consider the economics of transporting and caring for rural Alaskans if this virus were to take hold in our villages. And, I think that really raises a very good point about how serious this could be, not just for mushers or the mushing community or people who come in there, but really for the vulnerable, the elderly and those in rural Alaska who are very sick. And, as we've talked about often, there's it's not like Anchorage where you have a bunch of hospitals and a lot of doctors. It's in a lot of these villages, there's one doctor or sometimes a nurse or nurse practitioners or something like that. And to get serious medical attention is a very, very big deal.
It is. And speaking from personal experience, when we were out on the Serum Run expedition just about 2 weeks ago now, one of our mushers was hit by a snow machine right outside of the village in a place pretty close to where Allie and Jeff were hit by that drunk snow machiner several years ago. And that was a big deal, even though there was a very quick response from the folks in the villages. Most of them were volunteers. They took her immediately to the small health clinic right there in Galena, and it was staffed literally by a health aide, and that was about it. And she had a broken leg and a concussion, and the only thing that they could do to her was fly her out on an airplane. A plane flew in from Fairbanks or Anchorage or wherever and picked her up. Was there in about an hour and picked her up and flew her out. But if something like this were to occur in Nome, that would be a very similar situation. So I agree with her point about the expense of it all. And another point to that, Alex, Nome is a bigger village than most of the other villages around there. So if an outbreak were to occur, a lot more people would be coming into Nome to receive more treatment than they would at these very small health clinics on the outside of a city like Nome.
Right. And again, because this virus is different from a lot of other viruses in that people can have it and not realize it and be contagious before they start showing symptoms. It's possible that somebody could bring this in from Anchorage or from somewhere outside Alaska, come to Nome, and then someone from one of the other villages could also be in Nome and be exposed to this and then bring this back to their much smaller village. So, hopefully 6 months from now, we will look back on this and say, we took a lot of precautions and and we managed to dodge a bullet and not have very many people get sick, and hopefully very, very few people die from this. But I understand the wanting to take an abundance of caution to just make sure that everybody's okay.
And one final point to that, which is a little upsetting to me, on Facebook, of course, you and I are on all of the Facebook pages, all of the mushing pages, etc. And it's interesting that some of the more hardcore fans that I've seen and that I know of on social media are some of the biggest should I say the loudest voices about being upset with this, saying that, they spent hard-earned money to come up to Nome and now they can't do it. And even some of them are saying, that's it. I'm done following the race. I'm done with Iditarod. I'm done, spending my hard-earned money on this because of something that like this happened. And I know last night I kind of put you on the spot and said, how do you think that this will play out? I'm sure you've been following along on some of these discussions. What is your thought right now with a lot of these upset fans?
Well, I understand being upset, but a lot of these fans, like unfortunately a lot of people all over the internet, are just blustery, and they just want to hear themselves talk and threaten things. And I was talking to a longtime Iditarod volunteer this afternoon, and we were talking about this very thing. And he said, the Iditarod makes so much money out of fans who year after year say, that's it, I'm having nothing more to do with Iditarod. And then the next year they're back. So I understand people making threats like this, but it seems like, especially with Iditarod fans, they don't follow through with it very often.
And that's true in every sport, and we compare a lot. But you'll always hear during football season, the Browns don't make the playoffs again, and they say, that's it, I'm done. But every year, no matter what, the fans are full of Browns fans or Cowboys fans or Patriots fans or whatever. I think there's a heck of a lot of talk, but not a lot of action.
Yeah, and it's a delicate balancing act, because you really, really don't want to turn off people who have been fans for 20 or 30 years. And you want to be growing the sport, and you want to be growing the race and bringing more people in. So it's a balancing act, because you have to do what's right for the race and for the dogs and for the mushers, but you also have to do that in a way that doesn't seriously alienate the fans.
Yeah, and with Iditarod, it's almost the absolute perfect sport for somebody that can sit right in their home and have 100% fan participation right from their computer, isn't it?
Yeah, and I know that there are a lot of mushers who really actively dislike this, what they refer to as the armchair mushers, where people just will sit at home and they'll because they've been following the race for a year or two, they'll assume that they know everything, and that they will question why people will drop a dog or why people do this or that. I always try to give people the benefit of the doubt. Sometimes maybe a little bit too much, but I keep in mind, as someone who observes this race, that these are people who are a lot tougher than me. These are people who have earned their way to be in this race. And I have to assume that them doing what they need to do to get to the race carries with it more knowledge than I have.
Yeah. It's always amazing on both sides of the coin, for sure, being a musher and being a fan. I totally get what you're talking about there. So, Alex, before we do our musher profile of the evening, what else is on your plate?
I just want to plug again that I'm doing these daily Tales from the Trail stories about dogs, mushering, and sled dog races. And I have a new one up today, which is called The Checker. And the one coming up tomorrow is one of my favorites. It's called Girl Power.
And that is an appropriate story for sure, not only for our leader right now, Jesse Royer, but also our musher profile of the evening, who could easily become the Rookie of the Year. Who is that?
So today's musher profile is Millie Persold, and she is a rookie, but she is no newcomer to mushing. She grew up in Denmark, and she started mushing in 1992 at age 18. And so you can do the math yourself on how old she is. I believe that would make her 47 or thereabouts. She said that the Arctic is in her blood. Her great-grandfather founded the world's first Arctic research station in Greenland, and his sons traveled North America in the Arctic by dog team and canoe in the 1920s. Growing up, she says that she would sit in her grandfather's basement surrounded by drawings, mystical carvings, and sealskin clothing, listening to stories of his adventures. And then she decided there as a little girl that when she grew up, she wanted to be a dog musher and live her life with sled dogs. In 1992, she started doing mushing for polar explorer Will Steiger, and she would do months-long expeditions, starting in Canada and then eventually in Greenland, Russia, Sweden, Norway, Finland, and Alaska. She's done 15 long-haul expeditions with freight dogs and logged more than 1,000 nights sleeping in tents on trails in the Arctic. She has been the executive director of Go North Adventure Learning, which creates K-12 education plans based on dog sled expeditions and long-distance dog sled races like the Iditarod. And she told the Minneapolis Star Tribune, "I have stood in numerous situations where my life is on the line and the dogs are the ones pulling me out of it. When you face a polar bear, and these guys are the ones who've made the polar bear go away, I have stood on thin ice and the sled is going in, and you know it's not a situation you can pull the sled out. And it's the most unbelievable experience to see the dogs just come together and act as a machine, and then off we go." She was living 10 years ago in Afton, Minnesota, where she had a relatively small kennel, about 19 dogs. The city had a law saying that nobody could have more than 5 dogs at a time, and she was assured that she was going to get a variance to this rule so that she could keep her kennel there. And she ended up fighting with the city about this for over a year and eventually lost a city council decision unanimously. And one of the city councilors said, well, essentially, we are mushing her out of town. She didn't enter a dog sled race until 2011 when she ran the 800-mile Nadezhda Hope race in Russia. She is the partner of Yor Leifseth Olsen and is running in the Iditarod with the team Racing Berinja, which Yor runs with. She said that she spent her preseason building up to Iditarod assembling a team from scratch. And she has dogs from Didi Jeanro's lines, Jeff King, Dean Osmar, Sim Smith, and Jesse Holmes. Before the race, she told Alaska Public Media, "My challenge has been to basically create a team out of these guys so that they consider themselves a unit. And that's a different challenge than what she's used to running expedition dogs." And she said it's been a really, really gratifying experience. She told KTUU that her dogs are like NASCAR race cars. They respond to the slightest thing. They're incredible at what they do. And she says expedition dogs are much more stubborn. They don't react in the same pattern, but it's exactly that stubbornness that when you're standing in the wide open space and you're like, okay, so they use the sun, they use snowdrifts, everything around them to figure out which direction they're going. When she was in Ruby, she said that her favorite thing so far about this Iditarod has been going through this unbelievable landscape. And she said, until you actually run through it, it doesn't sink in how astonishing it is. And I know that she is a rookie this year, but it is a mistake to think of her as someone who is on par with a lot of the other rookies who just don't have very much experience in terms of years and in terms of the amount of time that they've put in on dog teams. She's done expeditions that lasted up to 6 months, where she went 3,000 miles, almost entirely sleeping outside. And as of right now, she is in 13th place out of Ruby. And I think it is it would be surprising to me if she doesn't get Rookie of the Year. She's doing extremely well. And I know there's a tendency sometimes to think of female mushers who are partners of male mushers, to think of them as just being, an extension of the male musher. But she is absolutely a very powerful force on her own.
That she is. And I was privileged enough a couple of years ago to hear her speak at a sled down conference that was held here in Anchorage. And she talked all about her expeditions and lots of pictures and videos. And she is one hardcore woman, that's for sure. And I think that she's going to do very well in not only this Iditarod, but for whatever comes. I know that she and Yor have done a lot of racing over in Russia. They do a race over there. I believe you mentioned that in your profile. And that is nothing to be sneezed about when you're over there mushing in Russia. I think that is a whole new extreme on its own.
Yeah, and we don't hear a lot about these races. There's not a lot of coverage in general about foreign races, but especially about races in Russia. I think over here we're lucky if we get a little bit of coverage with some of the Norwegian races, but that's pretty much it.
Yeah, so I am rooting for her for that Rookie of the Year for sure. I think that she will do very well and probably wrap that up in the coming days, as long as something doesn't happen out there on the trail, which it very well could. We're just a little bit over halfway now, and still a heck of a lot of racing to do. Don't you think that this seems to be going faster than normal? What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, we had talked about how much snow there was and how it was going to be a slower race, but it really does seem, at least at the front of the pack, like people are turning the speed on.
Yeah, I guess it's just that river running, and I have that experience in the last couple of weeks. If you don't get off the trail, it's a nice trail there on the Yukon. But I tell you what, if you step off a couple of feet one side to the other, you're going to be in chest-deep snow real quickly, and you're going to get stuck real easy if you aren't careful. But again, being on a dog team is a heck of a lot easier than being on a snow machine, so I think that they'll do very well. Alex, about 2 minutes left. Anything else before we close?
I just wanted to mention that right now we have 4 women in the top 12 or 13. And last year we had 3 women in the top 10. And I think that we might have even more this year.
And like we've said a lot on this show and our coverage, this is one of the very few sports out there in the world where women and men are on absolute equal footing. There is no difference between them. Often in other types of events, I'm thinking about softball and baseball, for example. It's sort of the same sport, but it's absolutely different in the two makeups and how they are. So this is a sport that is on equal footing, and it really puts a heck of a lot of equality in the sport itself, and I really applaud that.
Yeah, and I was talking with our friend Tony Ryder on Twitter this afternoon, and she was wondering when the last time was that a woman had won the First to Yukon award. And so I went and looked it up, and it turns out the last time that happened was in 1992 when Susan Butcher won and then went on to win the race. So it's time for a woman to win this race again, I think.
You say that every year, Alex, and hopefully this is the year for Jesse. And I think that we may have a winner on our hands. So we'll wait and see. Alex, it's always a pleasure, and we'll see you next time. And for folks that are listening, be sure to hit that subscribe button so you get our shows as soon as they drop. That's the easiest way to find us. And I know I keep saying that, but we get comments every day about when we're going to go on the air. So I think that that's probably the easiest way to get our shows. If not, follow us on social media, Dogworks Radio. Follow Alex at Coldfoot Films on Twitter. And I am at Robert Forto and at Dogworks Radio. And we will see you guys next time. Goodbye.
This episode of the podcast is sponsored by First Paw Coffee Company. Learn more at firstpaw.coffee.
From Dogworks Radio, this is Mushing Radio. We hope you enjoyed this episode, and we invite you to subscribe in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. You'll find a link on the episode notes. You can tap or swipe on the episode cover art, and you'll see some offers from our sponsors. You can support our show by supporting them. If you like what you have heard, we would love it if you could give us a 5-star rating and tell your friends how to subscribe too. Your hosts are Alex Stein and Robert Forto. Our producer is Robert Forto, created for Dogworks Radio. Did you know that Alaska Dogworks trains service dogs for those in need throughout North America? Each and every service dog that is trained through the Lead Dog Service Dog Program and Michelle Forto and her team has an individual training plan. We train for autistic, mobility, psychiatric, and PTSD for our soldiers for service work. If you know of someone that may need a service dog, please take a moment and check out Alaska Dogworks on social media and at alaskadogworks.com.